On the evening of December 24th, 2001, 48-year-old Kevin Butler was at his home in the Pleasant Grove neighborhood of southeast Dallas getting ready to head out for Christmas Eve dinner with his best friend Michael DiNardo. What Kevin didn't know was that two men had spent most of that afternoon drinking in their front yard a block behind his house and were planning to come over that night for reasons that had nothing to do with Christmas. Butler lived alone in his house and ran a local swimming pool company out of the area. According to his sister Kathy, he took in stray cats and dogs and treated them with love. The one he was closest to was an 18-inch white-crested cockatoo Kevin had taken in 2 years earlier from a roommate who'd have to move and couldn't bring him along. Kevin named him Bird. From people who knew their relationship, they knew one thing about Bird: he didn't take kindly to strangers. Back at the restaurant, after waiting for an hour, Michael DiNardo started to worry about his friend. Kevin wasn't picking up the phone, and that wasn't like him. After several calls went to voicemail, Michael decided to drive to his house to check up on him, but when he pulled up into the driveway, it was clear something was wrong. The front door of the house was wide open, and even though it was late at night, the lights inside the house were still on. Looking around, Michael also noticed that Kevin's pickup truck, the one he used to park in the driveway, was gone. Fearing something terrible had happened to his friend, Michael called 911. When officers from the Dallas Police Department arrived, they found the house ransacked. Items were scattered across the floor, drawers were pulled out, and furniture was overturned. Everything in that house felt like a fight had taken place. That feeling would be confirmed the moment they entered the living room. Kevin Butler lay in the middle of the floor with his arms and legs bound with electrical cord. His shirt was soaked through with blood as multiple stab wounds marked his chest and abdomen. There were bruises across his upper body from a beating, and his throat had been slashed. Whoever had done this hadn't been in a hurry. They had taken their time. But what the officers found next was even more bizarre. Looking through the rest of the house, officers walked into the kitchen where they found Bird lying on the floor near the back wall. He was missing a leg, his wings were broken, and there was a small pool of blood underneath him. A later forensic examination would confirm that he had been killed by a stab wound to the back. But there was one thing about the scene that caught the officers' attention even in all of this. The cockatoo's beak and claws were covered in blood. Police took both bodies to the Dallas County Medical Examiner's office and examined the rest of the house. In the living room, on a light switch a few feet from where the attack had taken place, they found another smear of blood. The same kind of blood was on the handles of 2 of the 4 knives recovered from the scene, but after forensic testing, it would later come to light that none of the blood at the scene had come from Kevin or Bird. Whoever had walked into Kevin's house that night had walked out of it bleeding. By now, police had DNA from 4 separate locations inside the house, but they had no name to match it to yet. The lead investigator, Detective Brent Malden, began working through Butler's co-workers, neighbors, and anyone who had a reason to have been around that house, and it didn't take long for a name to surface. Several people Butler worked with told police about a former employee he'd recently fired and had a public falling out with. That employee was 22-year-old Johnny Cerna, and he lived a block behind Butler's house with his 30-year-old half-brother Daniel Torres. Cerna had worked for Butler's pool company for some time. The exact length isn't on the public record, but it was long enough that Butler had come to trust him with company money. One day he was given a payment to cover an above-ground pool liner, but somewhere between Butler writing it out and the bank processing it, Cerna altered the check. When Butler found out, he fired Cerna on the spot, and in just a few months, what had started as a workplace dispute had turned into something else entirely. Malden brought them in for questioning a few days into the investigation. Both denied being anywhere near Butler's house that night. For now, he had nothing to hold them on, but before sending them home, Malden took their cheek swabs. If they'd bled inside Butler's house, the lab would confirm it. On paper, Cerna was the obvious lead. He was a fired employee with a fresh grudge against Butler, living less than 100 yards from the house where Butler had been killed. So all that was left now was to wait for the DNA results to put Cerna into that house. But this would prove to be more difficult. DNA testing in 2002 was still relatively new in everyday casework, and the Dallas County Crime Lab was running months behind on its caseload. When the results finally came back in July of 2002, it had been 7 months, and they weren't what Malden had expected. The blood on the light switch, the 2 knife handles, Bird's beak, and the fingerprints lifted from inside the house. None of it belonged to Serna. All of it traced back to his 30-year-old half-brother, Daniel Torres. Faced with the DNA evidence, Torres still denied being anywhere near Butler's house that night. He waived his Miranda rights and signed a written statement saying he had no idea how his blood had gotten inside, but Malden didn't believe his story. A few days later, Torres signed a second statement, this time admitting he had been inside Butler's house on Christmas Eve, but he hadn't touched him. In his version of events, he and Serna had been drinking in their front yard when Butler drove by and flipped them off. Serna had said he wanted Butler to pay. Sometime later, Torres noticed Serna had left, so he walked over to Butler's house to check on his half-brother. By the time he got there, Serna already had Butler on the floor and was stomping on him with a knife. Torres claimed he tried to wrestle the knife away and cut his hand doing it, so he panicked, grabbed Butler's truck keys, and took off. According to him, Butler was tied up on the floor and still alive when he left. He also said that during the struggle, the bird had come at him off the porch and pecked at him, in his own words, all over my head, and that he'd grabbed a fork and stabbed at it to make it stop. It explained everything in the kitchen, the injuries the bird suffered, and the trail of feathers running across the house. Confronted with his half-brother's evidence, Serna eventually broke as well. He told Malden that Daniel had been the one to slash Kevin's throat, while he had searched the rest of the house for valuables. Between the two of them, they walked out with around $1,200. Both were charged with capital murder. In February of 2003, Daniel Torres stood trial in the 292nd Judicial District Court of Dallas County in front of Judge Henry M. Wade Jr. The state's case rested on the DNA found from the different locations in the house. Torres was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. Johnny Serna was tried later that same year and given the same sentence. In his closing argument at Daniel Torres' trial, prosecutor George West had told the jury that Kevin's family had already known. Quote, "This bird spoke. He spoke to us. We know this bird will attack anybody who's attacking his owner. And who did he attack? Daniel Torres." Bird had given his life defending his owner and friend that night. Before he died, he'd left the mark that would eventually put his killer in handcuffs. In September of 2018, the quiet streets of South Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania became the scene of one of the most brutal murders in the city's recent history. But the first sign that something was wrong wasn't a 911 call or a frantic witness. It was a single panicked golden retriever running loose on Cary Avenue at 3 in the morning with nobody chasing him and nowhere left to go. Shortly after, residents in the area began calling in reports of a stray golden retriever wandering the streets. Police Sergeant Joseph Ziegler was dispatched to the location and found the animal unharmed at the nearby Turkey Hill mini-mart that he'd wandered into. The officer was in luck. The dog was wearing a collar, which helped identify its name, Joe. The collar also carried his owner's phone number and address. Figuring this would be a simple find and return case, Officer Ziegler called the owner, but nobody picked up. The same silence would follow after the second and third call. When none of his calls got through, the officer had no choice but to drive the dog to his 14 Donald Court address, roughly half a mile from the store. It was nearing 4 a.m., and the owner was likely asleep. But when the officer reached the address, something clearly wasn't right. The door to the house was unlocked and the lights were on inside. Maybe the owner had gone out looking for the dog after Joe got out and lost his way. So Ziegler tried the doorbell a few times, hoping somebody would eventually come around to the front door, but nobody responded. That's when he realized this was no longer a routine call and asked for backup. Within minutes, the quiet neighborhood became unrecognizable. Flashing police cruisers lined the street with yellow tape stretched across the lawn. Once the officers got inside the house, it was clear something terrible had happened. The first floor was a complete mess. There was blood everywhere. The kitchen floor was littered with items, and the patio and garage doors were wide open. But it wasn't until they got to the second floor that the cops realized what they were dealing with. As they approached the master bedroom, they saw a man face down on the floor near the nightstand. His shirt was soaked with blood. The sight alone was bad enough, but the smell was worse. The gash in his lower back, along with the 8.5-inch knife lying just feet away, made it clear how he'd died. Everything in the room was either scattered or overturned, which told the police he hadn't gone down without a fight. But while searching, officers found something far more chilling: a red gas can sitting near the victim's body. The man was identified as 58-year-old Fred Boot. The patrolman who found him, James Fisher, had known him personally for years. Boot was a well-loved member of the Wilkes-Barre community and a father to 4 grown children. His wife Erin had passed away 3 years earlier in 2015, but rather than let her memory fade with time, Fred kept it alive by setting up a scholarship in her name. His obituary would read how welcoming he was and how much he loved his dogs, Mia and Joe. In the end, it was Joe who led the cops to that house. Now it was up to them to bring Fred's killer to justice. Their first lead came from Brian, Fred's son. Brian had been trying to reach his father, but like Officer Ziegler, he'd called him repeatedly until the silence became impossible to ignore. That's when he pinged his father's phone and discovered it wasn't at Donald Court. It was a few blocks away on Willow Street. The phone was one of only 2 things taken from Fred's house that night. The other was a $20 bill. Neither of them gave investigators much to work with, but all of that would change in the next 12 hours. At roughly 1 p.m., locals reported a fire in the basement of a nearby apartment building on Maffitt Street. When firefighters arrived, they found a pile of clothing and shoes burning in the shared basement of the building with a layer of tar paper draped over the top. The fire had been set deliberately. Believing it might be connected to the murder from earlier that morning, they contacted the police. The pattern on the soles of the shoes was an exact match for the bloody footprints leading away from Fred Boot's bedroom. Whoever had tried to burn Fred's lifeless body the night before had later gone to 95 Maffitt Street to destroy any evidence of their presence. This was the killer's second attempt to erase himself from the evidence, but it would fail spectacularly. Earlier, before the fire was reported, a surveillance camera had recorded a man walking into Geisinger's South Wilkes-Barre Hospital. His hands were badly torn up and bleeding, the kind of wounds you'd get from losing your grip on a knife mid-swing. He told the hospital staff he'd been assaulted the previous night, and they had no real reason to question him, but the cops eventually would. That same day, a woman named Carmen Carty walked into a police station and reported her 14-year-old daughter, Louisa Reyes, missing. According to Carmen, Louisa had left the night before with her boyfriend and was potentially in danger. That boyfriend was the same man captured on the hospital surveillance camera that morning, with his hands wrapped in bloody bandages. In the span of less than 24 hours, police were now juggling 4 separate incidents: a murder, an arson, a hospital walk-in with knife injuries, and a missing teenage girl. And all 4 led back to the same man, 31-year-old Reynaldo Mercado. He lived in the building at 95 Maffitt Street, only a few blocks from Willow Street, where Fred's phone was located. The same building where the basement fire had been set hours earlier. Mercado was staying there with Louisa, the 14-year-old daughter of Fred's ex-girlfriend. She had once lived at Fred's house herself with her mother Carmen until Fred ended the relationship that summer. But by the time police had pieced this together, Mercado was already across state lines planning to flee the country to the Dominican Republic. He would have been successful if it wasn't for one mistake Mercado had told his uncle. He and Reyes had shown up at his uncle's house in West New York the night before. The plan was simple: get into New York City in the morning, get a passport, and fly out. Jose didn't believe him at first, so Mercado pulled up the local news reports from Wilkes-Barre and showed his uncle the headlines about Fred Boot. Jose Mercado had just listened to his nephew confess to killing a man in Pennsylvania, and like any responsible citizen, he told the police everything. Mercado was arrested in West New York the next day and was extradited back to Wilkes-Barre that same week. 2 years later, a Luzerne County jury convicted him on every count: first-degree murder, arson, robbery, and abuse of a corpse. He was sentenced to life in prison. Louisa Reyes was tried as an adult despite being 14. She took a plea deal and was given 40 years. After the verdict, the Boot family released a short, heartfelt statement Fred would have been proud of. As for Joe, the dog who set the entire investigation into motion, he went home with Brian, Fred's son. The scholarship Fred had set up in Erin's name now also carries his: the Fred and Erin Boot Scholarship for the Arts. On the morning of December 30th, 2018, a police officer from the Virreyes Oeste police station stood guard outside a crime scene in the Presidente Perón neighborhood of San Fernando, Argentina. What he didn't know was that someone else was still in the victim's house. While waiting for the forensics team, he heard a woman scream from inside, which was strange because the only person in there was already dead. When he went to check, nothing had changed. The body was right where he'd left it. Then the scream came again, and this time he traced it to a green parrot in a cage by the wall, shrieking the same words at full volume. "Oh, please let me go. Oh no." And at first, no one took it seriously. It was too strange to be a clue, and too senseless to mean anything. The reason the officer was there in the first place was around 6 a.m., a man named Miguel Santorino Roland called 911. Roland, who went by Mambo, told officers he'd come home from his overnight shift at the Virreyes Rugby Club, about 100 meters away, and found a woman dead in her room. When officers arrived at the house, they found the wooden loft in complete disarray. There were mattresses on the floor, items scattered around the room, and in the middle of it was the body of a woman lying face up, without clothes, and with bruises across her face and body, suggesting brutal physical violence. As officers walked through the scene, Roland wrapped both hands around his own throat and suggested that she had probably been strangled. This was strange considering the forensic team hadn't arrived yet, and nobody in that house should have known how she died. The woman was 46-year-old Elizabeth Alejandra Toledo. Known to the people around her as Ellie, she had a moderate intellectual disability and rented the wooden loft at the top of House 27, at the corner of Boedo and Garidi Streets in the Presidente Perón neighborhood. The parrot in the cage was hers. Ellie had raised it in her care and called it Patchouli. Over time, the two of them had grown close enough that the bird had learned the sounds and phrases of her daily life. Apart from her pet, she shared the house with 3 men. Roland was described as her partner. The second man was 64-year-old George Alvarez, known as Tio George. The third had been kicked out by the landlord 2 weeks earlier, specifically because the landlord had caught him physically abusing Ellie. According to people in her life, the abuse had been going on for some time. None of it had ever been reported. Within days, prosecutor Bibiana Santella from the Gender Violence Unit of San Fernando had all 3 men brought in for questioning. The third was cleared almost immediately when the landlord confirmed he'd been expelled from the property roughly 15 days before the murder, which gave him a verified alibi. That left Roland and Alvarez, who were arrested in January 2019 and held in pre-trial detention, neither of whom agreed to testify. In the meantime, the autopsy was performed by Dr. Federico Corasaniti, and it confirms that Ellie had been sexually assaulted during the attack, hit multiple times, and then manually strangled, which eventually took her life. All of these injuries had been inflicted while she was still alive. As a result, after nearly 3 years of pretrial detention, Roland walked out a free man. But during the trial, the prosecution also brought forward evidence that went beyond the question of who killed Ellie, and spoke to what her life had been like before the night she died. One of those details came from the police officer who had been stationed at the loft on December 30th. He told the court about the scream he heard coming from inside the room, and the words he eventually traced back to Patchouli's cage. "Oh, please let me go. Oh no." These words were formally entered into the case file as evidence, and they were not the only words Patchouli had learned. A neighbor who ran a small shop down the street and used to sell Ellie birdseed for the parrot also appeared in the case file and said she had once heard the parrot repeat a different phrase, "Why did you hit me?" And she remembered exactly when she heard it. It was right around the time the third man had been kicked out of the house for hitting Ellie. Once you give this detail enough attention, it changes how you see everything else in this case, because for a parrot to commit a particular sentence to memory, it usually needs to hear that phrase repeated many times for the sound to register. "Please let me go," or "Why did you hit me?" isn't something a parrot learns from a single night. So for Patchouli to say those words, Elizabeth would have had to say them over and over across multiple weeks in the same desperate tone every time. This means what the officer heard that morning wasn't a recording of her final moments. It was a recording of her everyday life.
A parrot can repeat up to 150 words depending on the species. But specifically, you have to repeat many times for a parrot to say something like that, "No, please let me go." It's quite complex what the parrot learned. Imagine what this woman must have suffered before these two men ended up murdering her.
As for Alvarez, the evidence against him was much more direct. During the autopsy, the organic remains collected from the victim's body matched his genetic profile. On top of that, an eyewitness also placed him entering and leaving the house around the time of the attack. To make it even more disturbing, roughly 10 days after the murder, an acquaintance walked into the prosecutor's office and reported that Alvarez had confessed to him that he had gone to the house, had sexual intercourse with Elizabeth, and only afterward realized she had already passed. But the forensic evidence proved otherwise and confirmed that the injuries were consistent with sexual assault inflicted while Ellie was still alive. The court convicted him of aggravated sexual assault and femicide and sentenced him to life in prison. As for Petrulli, he was taken in by one of Ellie's sisters after the trial. It's not been reported whether it ever repeated those words again, but for however long it lived, it carried the only recording that existed of what Ellie's life sounded like inside that loft. In the fall of 1994, a woman's car was found abandoned in a field on Prince Edward Island, Canada's smallest province. The island's a popular holiday destination in summer, but in winter it became cold, quiet, and buried under heavy snow. With a population of roughly 100,000 at the time, it was a close-knit community where pretty much everyone knew each other. But this abandoned car would set off one of the most horrifying murder investigations on the island, and eventually push investigators into territory no murder case had gone before. It belonged to 32-year-old Shirley Duguay. Shirley was a mother of 5. She stood 4 feet 9 inches tall and weighed less than 100 pounds. Because of her height, she kept a pillow in the driver's seat of her car so she could see over the steering wheel comfortably. On October 3rd, 1994, Shirley left her children in the care of her father, Melvin, and went out to run a few errands, only to never return home.
Well, we found it very odd that no one had reported her missing initially, and of course it raised some suspicion with us.
Shirley Duguay had been known in the past to take off for a couple of days, not tell anyone where she had gone, and then return.
When she didn't come back after several hours, Melvin didn't report her missing right away, as it wasn't unusual for Shirley to take off for a few days without telling anyone. But this time, the previously harmless pattern proved to be fatal. What her family didn't know yet was that the man she'd spent years trying to get away from had already made sure she wouldn't be coming back. 4 days later, a local woman called police about an abandoned car in a field near Highway 169. The license plates had been removed, and inside, investigators found blood spatter on the windshield and across the interior, the kind of pattern caused by someone being struck repeatedly. The pillow Shirley used while driving was also found close to the car, soaked in blood. For the police, it was the first clear sign that Shirley hadn't simply taken off for a few days, and when they tested it against a sample from Melvin, it confirmed what they were afraid of. The blood carried half of his genetic markers, meaning it belonged to Shirley. But there was no body to be found anywhere nearby, and on Prince Edward Island, where people were not used to violent crimes like this, the case quickly became one of the largest searches the province had ever seen. RCMP officers, 120 military personnel from CFB Gagetown, students from the Atlantic Police Academy, and local residents searched across hundreds of square miles and waterways for months. The first useful item they found was a shovel about a half-mile from the car. Attached to it were 2 long black hairs. When compared with hair from Shirley's hairbrush, the hairs were microscopically similar, enough to make investigators believe the shovel had likely been used after the attack. And weeks later, roughly 15 miles away, inside a plastic bag, they found a pair of white size 9 sneakers and a man's brown leather jacket, also stained with Shirley's blood. The jacket was far too large for Shirley, but when investigators examined the lining, they found something unusual. Roughly 20 brittle white hairs pressed into the fabric. Under a microscope, the center of each hair was much thicker than investigators would expect from human hair. Investigators suspected these hairs to be cat hairs, which was a major roadblock, because no one had ever used animal DNA in a criminal investigation before, and this meant that there was no forensic framework to interpret it. However, by now, the police already had their main suspect. Shirley had been in a relationship with a man named Douglas Beamish for roughly 15 years, and these 15 years were traumatic for Shirley, to say the least. Douglas was a demolition worker with a documented history of domestically abusing her during this period. In 1991, a peace bond, Canada's version of a restraining order, had been issued against him. When Shirley finally left and moved back to Prince Edward Island with the kids, hoping the smallest province in the country would be far enough to put distance between her and Douglas, he followed her there. By the time Shirley disappeared, he was living with his parents just a short drive away. In cases like this, an abusive former partner would naturally be one of the first people the police looked at. But in this case, Douglas's history with Shirley wasn't the only reason for them to be suspicious of him. In the summer of 1992, during one of their earlier separations, he had written her a letter threatening to kill her before he'd allow her to get custody of their children. But when the investigators visited his parents' house to question Douglas, he denied everything. He claimed he hadn't seen Shirley for almost a week before she disappeared, and said their last conversation had been pleasant. He also denied owning the brown leather jacket, and even though the sneakers found in the bag were size 9, the same size he wore, he insisted they weren't his. At that point, investigators had no direct way to prove otherwise. But during that visit, Constable Roger Savoy noticed something that stayed with him. Douglas's parents had a pure white cat named Snowball, and at some point during the interview, the cat rubbed against Savoy's leg, leaving fine white hairs on his trousers. They looked almost identical to the brittle white hairs found inside the blood-stained jacket, so if those hairs had really come from Snowball, then the jacket Douglas denied owning could be linked to the household where he was living, but proving that was another problem entirely.
If we could prove that it was this particular cat's hair, then we would be able to say, well, this belonged to Mr. Beamish, the jacket. And the job was to find someone that could do this type of testing.
Savoy began calling DNA labs across Canada and the United States, asking if anyone could test cat hair and match it back to a specific cat. Eventually, the investigators found Dr. Stephen O'Brien at the National Cancer Institute in Maryland, a geneticist who'd spent decades studying hereditary illness in cats. O'Brien's team adapted feline DNA profiling for the case, using genetic markers to compare the hair from the jacket with Snowball's blood. It was a technique that had never been attempted in a criminal investigation before. But even then, the evidence almost disappeared before it could matter. Of the roughly 20 cat hairs recovered from the jacket lining, only one had a root with enough DNA to test, which meant the entire theory came down to a single hair. The DNA from that root matched Snowball's blood at every marker tested. Now that sounds like the end of the question, but later during the trial, it could very likely open a new one. Prince Edward Island is geographically isolated, so if the island's cat population was heavily inbred, it was possible that many cats could share a similar genetic profile. In that case, the match would be completely meaningless. To address that, O'Brien's team tested blood from 20 random cats across the island.
You need to know that some other cat on Prince Edward Island couldn't have contributed that hair. What if 25% of the cats on Prince Edward Island had the same DNA profile, or 10%, or even 1 in 100 cats?
The results showed that the probability that the hair came from any cat other than Snowball was roughly 1 in 45 million. But even with this tying the jacket to Douglas with almost certainty, in order to arrest him, the police needed a crime. They still had no evidence that could tell them where Shirley was or prove what exactly happened to her after she disappeared. That changed several months later, when a trout fisherman walking along the Enmore River noticed a pile of brush on the riverbank that didn't look natural. Underneath it was a shallow hole only a few feet wide and unusually short for a regular grave. But for someone who stood only 4 feet 9 inches tall, it was enough. Inside, investigators found Shirley Duguay. The condition of her remains confirmed that the blood in the car had only been the beginning of the attack. Her nose had been broken, her jaw had been fractured in 3 places, and one of her front teeth had been knocked out with enough force that it was later found embedded in her lung. Her hands had also been tied behind her back, and from the injuries, the medical examiner determined that Shirley had died from blunt force trauma and strangulation. With that, the missing person case became a murder case. Douglas Beamish was arrested and charged with murder. At trial, the cat's DNA was presented alongside the human blood evidence. On September 19, 1996, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole in 18 years. It became the first murder conviction in the world based on animal DNA.